Hello everyone. In this series of video lectures, we're going to discuss some background information regarding Beowulf, the epic poem that we're going to start this course with. I will reflect on the status and genre of this work. In terms of the four core concepts that we're going to be considering in this series of video lectures, we're going to start with that background information. I'll talk to you a little bit of the cultural context for this epic poem that we're reading. Now, epic poem is not a colloquialism, it's actually a specific genre of literature, and we'll talk about that in the epic poem section of this lecture. What exactly an epic poem is, definitionally, and from there, we'll move on to a more generalized theory that we can apply to the analysis of texts in anticipation of the mock English exit exam that you're going to be taking in week 5 of this course. In order to build on that theory and help to apply it, I'll go through an example of the application of those techniques in the first section of this text, the first 85 lines of the poem Beowulf. First, the original text was written nearly 1,000 years ago in Old English, and it probably began, as most epic poems do, as an oral narrative being told and retold in a kind of almost like campfire narrative, wherein the heroic deeds of a mytho-historical figure, Beowulf, would have been related to a company of people. This then took on the form of a written text eventually. Now, Old English is the original source of this text. It was originally written in Old English. Now, you may be familiar with the sound of Shakespearean English, such as, "You do look, my son, in a moved sort, as if you were dismayed. Be cheerful, sir, our revels now are ended. These our actors, as I foretold you, were but spirits, and are vanished into air." So the language of Elizabethan English is essentially the same as ours. There are those these and thous that you might have heard in Shakespeare, but the words are pretty much the same. So if you went back from Shakespeare's era 400 years, you would end up in Middle English, in terms of the language, and that is far more difficult to interpret. An example of that would be Chaucer's Middle English and the Canterbury Tales. Then, if you go back another 300 years or so, you'll enter into Old English. This text was originally written in a language that is almost fundamentally alien to us. We wouldn't recognize it as English if we heard it spoken today. If you take a look at the description for this video, you'll see a recitation of the first lines of Beowulf, and you'll hear just a few small sounds that seem like they are akin to English. So, for instance, you'll hear, "That was good kinging." Obviously, my pronunciation is not nearly as good as the orator that I have cited, but that's just, "he was a good king," or "that was good kinging." The text that we're using is an edited translation from the original Old English. Much is lost in the elision from a poetic form to a more narrative form. So there are alterations made to the structure of the presentation of this material in order to better accommodate readability. What we have in Beowulf is fundamentally a conflict between two very different cultures that are entering into conversation with each other and that are being reflected in the values and the ideas that are being presented in the text. In the end, you have a kind of pagan worldview of a multiplicity of deities, blood guilt and blood feuds among small tribal civilizations, and the new burgeoning understanding of a Christian religion that is entering into the region with fundamentally and antithetically different values. So those values of the singular creative God who is privileging mercy, grace, and forgiveness in place of the blood feuds that dominated the prior civilization. So the poem Beowulf enters into the scene. It is composed in this time of great cultural upheaval as new and old pagan and Christian values are being put into conversation. And so we see both of those sets of values in this poem, in conversation, and an attempt perhaps to illustrate the supremacy and superiority of those incoming Christian values over the prior pagan ones. This is a work, thus, of great tension, and these tensions between values and concepts of heroism threaten to rend the work apart. The poem marks a point of transition and attempted reconciliation between pre-existent pagan traditions and those of emergent Christianity. Now, the earliest manuscript that we have of this text dates back to the year 1000 or thereabouts. Now, the story was probably being told as early as the year 700, but we have no record of such, probably because it was originally an oral form of storytelling that created this narrative, and obviously manuscript evidence for most texts is quite far removed from the date of the narrative's conception. Now, In order to understand this piece, we need to reflect upon a few of the different concepts that help to define the pagan culture that's depicted, and also something about the genre of the epic poem. In the former case, the Wergild is also known as the death price or blood money. So, in this culture, it would be common to either seek restitution against your adversaries for the death or the wounding of a loved one by way of blood. So, in this tribal civilization where blood feuds dominated, a small clan would seek revenge against an enemy tribe based on the damage that's been inflicted upon them. And this would lead to a kind of reciprocal escalating conflict between the two peoples, largely based on the presumptions and the dictates of their honor culture, or a culture that privileges honor, personal and collective, and thus has to defend it. The allowance of an injury to a family member or the death of a family member or a tribe member to go unpunished would be to invite destruction because it would make you appear weak, or it would compromise your sense of honor. So there's this complex interweaving of personal and collective honor and the survival of the tribe or the civilization. The Wergild was a way of short-circuiting these kinds of blood feuds. Rather than seeking recompense in the form of actual literal blood, another tribe could instead seek the Wergild or the death price. You could ask to be recompensed monetarily by gold for the loss that your tribe has suffered. And that would satisfy both the demands of justice and honor as they are understood in this culture, and prevent future blood feuding and future retaliations. The matter would be settled. This idea of the reciprocality of violence and the cycle of violence being perpetuated and only short-circuited by way of the Wergild is then juxtaposed against a Christian understanding of the world which privileges forgiveness even in the face of violence. Or Jesus is asked by one of his disciples, "If my brother wrongs me, how many times should I forgive him?" And Jesus says, not 7 times, but 7 times 77 times. And Jesus also said in the Gospels that if you should be struck on one side of the cheek, you should turn the other cheek and allow that to be struck as well. So there's this idea of the passive reception of violence and repaying good for evil to those who have hurt you. These kinds of values and Christian presumptions and worldviews are fundamentally at odds with the civilizational structures and presumptions of a culture to whom honor is paramount, and that blood feuds were a natural and necessary component to maintain their civilization and ensure their survival of the tribe. So think about these kinds of values and these potential points of conflict as you continue to read the poem. The nature of the epic poem. An epic poem is a particular genre of poetry. It is a long-form, serious narrative poem. In other words, it's incredibly lengthy. It's not 14 lines like a sonnet. It's thousands of lines, potentially, like Beowulf. It is focused on the narrative development. So it's not about feeling, per se. It's about telling a story. And it is in poetry rather than prose. It's in verse rather than prose. Some of the key elements of the epic poem as a genre and as a style, as in Beowulf. The epic poem is fundamentally a celebration in oral form of a national or epic hero. This national hero embodies certain cultural presumptions and values. He's meant to be almost like the representative of the culture. He instantiates and lives out that culture's beliefs about itself, the best that it can possibly be, and in fact, better than it can possibly be. The hero that is at the heart of the epic poem, that goes on fantastical quests, or engages in titanic exploits, imposing himself on the world, is better than any human being could ever hope to be. He is grandiose, exaggerated, the best of that culture, and also a person possessed of great appetites and potentially flaws. Epic poems, quite frequently, were originally in an oral form. So if you think of the most famous epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, these works were originally told. They were originally spoken. Only many years after codification, development, evolution through telling and retelling were they ever written down. Usually, these epic poems have a kind of national purpose that articulate a founding myth. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, you have innumerable nation states spawning off of the events that transpired in those poems. In Paradise Lost, it's the establishment of the kingdom of God, in essence. And in Beowulf, you have founding narratives surrounding the Danes and the Geats, and it tells their ancient mytho-history. So they're a foundational or national myth. It's a kind of just so story about the history of the way in which this nation state, civilization, or people evolved. And it looks back into the creation of this mythological history in order to establish their founding by some phenomenal individual. So in this case, we have Shield Chieftain and the events of his experiences in the first 85 lines. And then later on, we have Beowulf and his foundation of the various different nations as he aggregates a variety of different tribes into his community. Oftentimes, the subjects of these narratives would be familiar to the audience, even though somebody like Beowulf or Achilles or Odysseus are alien to us. The audience for these original epic poems would have had a cultural familiarity with these people. Stories themselves are rife with conflicts. The hero will oftentimes, in the conventions of epic poetry, engage in arming scenes, where he will have these elaborate, ornate descriptions of the armor and the weapons that he is using in order to go forth and face his enemies, monsters, or other great heroes from other nations. Epic poems are defined by elaborate stylistic devices, fantastical extended metaphors, and intense evocative imagery. They're designed to convey something that is epic in scope. They are vast in attention and scope and narrative, and they are meant to convey grandeur. Beowulf itself, as an epic poem, was largely forgotten by literary criticism. So for almost 1800 years, nobody studied it as a work of literature, often viewed more as a curiosity and a reflection of a particular society rather than something that was worthy of analysis as a work of fine art. This perspective on Beowulf, the poem, changed largely due to Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings. He presented a series of lectures and papers on this work, arguing for its literary and poetic merit as opposed to its simple historical significance. Tolkien spoke out against critics of the novel and highlighted the function of the various different monsters in this poem. Grendel, Grendel's mother, that we're not going to really read about, and the dragon in the last section of this text that, again, we're not going to read about. We'll be focusing on Grendel. But as a work in monster making, in the study of monsters, it holds a special place in the canon of English literature. Tolkien argued that the monsters in this work are in fact key elements to our understanding of the narrative and what it's trying to articulate about the cultural that of the author and the growing or the evolving understanding of both Christian values and pagan ones and how they're being put into conversation. This text, then, Tolkien argued, should be studied as a work of art and not just as a kind of historical document that gives us insight into how people were living at this time. As is typical for an epic poem, we have the central hero of this work, Beowulf, being extolled. So this poem probably would have been told by a kind of bard who would sing of and celebrate the legendary feats of this national hero, Beowulf. In the sections of this poem that we are not reading for this course, it becomes clear that this entire poem is a kind of complex reflection on that interplay between two cultures, one emerging, the Christian paradigm, and one that is dying away, the pagan one, and a reflection on the transience of the nature of the epic hero of bygone ages, the kinds of drives that define Beowulf as a pagan hero, his lust for conquest, the eternal desire for glory and self-glorification, are ultimately ephemeral. And so the poem ends, in the section that we're not reading, with almost a lament over the transitory nature of that glory and of all the successes and the might that we can have as human beings. In the next video lecture, we're going to talk about the identification of subjects and themes now that we have this background historical information.